Hello and welcome to another episode of Fractional Impact. Today we're speaking to Chris Taylor, CFO working inside early stage MedTech and healthcare companies to help them navigate the financial realities of building in a highly regulated, evidence-driven market. We'll cover what founders often miss when building financial strategy in MedTech, how to align product, capital, and market reality into a single operating model, and more. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast here today, and wonderful to be able to address the audience concerning the unique aspects of MedTech. As you mentioned, there are multi-dimensional aspects to this business model, and how are we optimizing capital to flow into this space? It's a critical area and a highly evolving area. So as we get into the discussion, I'm excited to share a little bit more about what that looks like, what early stage MedTech founders and early stage teams are dealing with right now, and how individuals such as myself in that CFO capacity have had to evolve within those engagements to provide them a much more comprehensive service profile.
Awesome. And we're joined as well by Finn Patrick from the Fractional Clients team. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Finn.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Very excited to have Chris on the show today. So my name's Finn. I've been a fractional executive. This will be my 11th year, and always love speaking specifically to other fractional types as well. Chris being a CFO, and specifically within MedTech, I'm very excited to get into some of the kind of nuances of that field and understand it a little bit more from my own point of view. So very excited to have Chris on the show.
Awesome. First thing I want to ask you, Chris, just so that the listeners can get a better sense of really who you are and what you've done. Tell us what you've been doing over the last few years and how you've ended up here.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. So I've been in MedTech for a little over 15 years now in total. Have worked everything from small to mid-cap MedTech device companies to consulting in large Fortune 500. And through that experience, have been in leadership roles from corporate development to innovation to strategy, and all with a sort of deep financial component to them. Stepped out in 2019 to start Azer 21. Over that time, have built a portfolio of MedTech companies where we really focus on becoming a part of the operating team of the company. Azer 21 is more than just fractional CFO services, which often sounds kind of like a consultant. We're certainly that plus more. We add in a judgment layer into these MedTech companies that's unique to the business models of their type. The results have been, I would say, we're a little over 100 million that we've been able to raise on behalf of our portfolio companies over the last 6 years. That's been in the range from early stage pre-seed deals all the way up to Series B, Series C stage deals. So this is spanning everything from early stage, how do we help finance early stage discovery work, all the way up to late stage pivotal trial work, ultimately positioning companies for exit acquisition or further commercialization investments. So we sort of fit that niche of MedTech and providing that judgment layer to help founders build a more comprehensive view of the company, help them get we'll talk a little bit about investor grade versus investor ready, really getting them into that investor grade status, ultimately helping to build in the capital plans and executional logic for their companies.
Interesting. Most MedTech startups are largely built around the technology first. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between how companies are built and how value is actually created?
Yeah, good question. The biggest disconnect happens where I see it is organizations, they're usually focused on product progress, where investors are usually interested more around risk reduction. They're not the same thing. So I've seen cases where teams will spend 12, 18 months, either improving device performance, completing engineering iterations, running complex clinical studies. But ultimately, it doesn't really change the market's view of the business. Now, the market is asking slightly different questions. It's looking at it through the lens of, say, is the regulatory path becoming more predictable? Is the clinical evidence becoming more decision useful? Have we been able to demonstrate some adoption metrics around reimbursement? Is that becoming more plausible? Within the medtech industry, this all sounds very obvious, but it's not necessarily how companies in their early stages are run. They're very functionally aligned, very silo driven. So you have like engineering drives product, regulatory drives submission, clinical manages, all the clinical evidence generation. Finance, we are very interested in burn rates. Commercial starts building the adoption story. What is often missing is that integrative logic. Where are we looking at and evaluating all of the possible things we could do next, and which thing removes the constraint that's depressing value today? McKinsey has researched on this. They've looked at MedTech and what really matters. They look at it more at the industry level, but what they would say and what they've said is value creation in MedTech is much more about the interconnectedness across these functions, and that requires an evolved operating model. This is not an isolated functional excellence. We're really good at engineering, we're really good at this. This is that integrated judgment layer that needs to sit over all the top of that. So I often use the phrase, medtech companies are not insight constrained. They do often have very unique insights. And it's not level of effort. I mean, everybody's doing really great work and everybody's very smart on these teams, much smarter than me. And sometimes it's not even necessarily money. I mean, capital continues to flow into this space. What I find challenging, and where that biggest disconnect is have we sufficiently built out the framework of translating progress into an investor level relevant risk discussion, risk reduction discussion? When that framework is weak, companies kind of confuse motion with value creation.
Very cool. So, Chris, as capital has tightened, what does investor grades look like today versus 5 years ago?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we use this sense of investor ready versus investor grade. What is really the difference between those two? What I would argue is, what's changed in the last 5 years isn't the existence of capital. It's not that the money isn't there. It really has more to do with what I call the shape of underwriting. Go back 5 years ago in lower rate environment, investors generally could afford to tolerate longer periods between, what's sort of being promised and what are the proof points. Now, not so much. Today, they're much more explicit about what each round of financing is really buying. And when I mean buying, I'm using that interchangeably with underwriting. What they want to know is what risk is being retired, what evidence is being created to essentially justify the retirement of those risks, what strategic options are opening up related to, say, okay, now we have this clinical evidence that sort of points us in this A, B, or C. Is this now giving us a much clearer signal around A is going to be the highest probability outcome for this? What that does is positions the company for that next round at a meaningfully different price, a meaningfully improving price. And we see this in market structure. So JP Morgan has looked at this, EY has looked at this. If we look at 2025 as an example, I think it's somewhere around 11 or 12 billion dollars has been invested in medtech. That's not that's not the important message. The important message is how much of that is starting to shift into later rounds. And so what we're seeing is sort of this downward shift where Series B and later is now dominating deal flow within MedTech right now. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that capital is gone. It really means that investors are starting to invest in fund conviction, but it wants sharper proof before it does that. So that's what I mean when I say investor grade. When I say investor grade, it's a company that's really learned to present itself not as like a science project or like an interesting technology program. It's this compounding risk reduction story. Investor grade, those companies are able to create laser focus around those few variables that really matter at the stage that they're in. So they can explain, this is how much money, this is what we're doing with it, and this is specifically what risk is going to be retired. You also have to talk about, well, we're not going to solve these risks. If you're talking with a pre-seed discovery stage MedTech company, they're not going to spend a lot of money on figuring out what the reimbursement pathway is. There needs to be some base assumptions talked about. That is not a risk that a seed stage investor is going to be looking at a company to retire at that point. So we have to be prescriptive around, these are the risks that need to be retired given this dollar that creates that next value inflection point. That is a much more demanding standard to be able to get to that point. Everybody's investor ready, meaning like anybody can take investor meetings. Investor grade means that higher standard, I'm able to articulate that. And where that really matters is now you get a company that the market can really underwrite. Now they know how to price this much more accurately. So as we sort of take a look at what's happened over the last 5 years, it's really pulling earlier stage companies into this investor grade status. So you got to be much more laser focused on what it is you have to demonstrate.
Interesting. So you're talking there about how companies that want to be investor grade, they need to be kind of relentless in upping their standards for, as you called it, retiring risk to show investors and that kind of thing. How can they go about that in practice, or how, with your involvement, how do you actually make that happen, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you could kind of call it this judgment layer. And this is where we need to move beyond just the functional view or value creation points. This is not a budget. It's not an org chart. It's really the logic around how engineering, regulatory, clinical, quality, market access, finance, how all of that is coordinated. So everybody working in a company is going to be busy, but how do all the activities within that cumulatively de-risk that business? So great question. And this is where the role of CFO in MedTech is really evolving, is really exciting. Because what we're seeing is, we're more than finance. We have to be more than finance. Early stage MedTech demands that my role is the individual forcing that integration. It's my job to ask, what does the next round require? And what does that next acquirer conversion require? Like, what are they really looking for?
Interesting.
And Chris, you talk about operating models. What does that actually mean in MedTech?
Yeah, let me give you a specific example. We would have a company, say, preparing for a clinical study. Every MedTech is going to have to go through some level of clinical study. That's an activity that's perfectly reasonable from a technical standpoint, and needed from a regulatory standpoint. Where I think earlier stage companies are looking at from an operating model is to say, if the endpoints for those studies don't help future payer conversations. So again, we're looking at this integration between regulatory and commercial. If the patient population that we're looking doesn't mirror the adoption setting, if that's the case, the study's not going to move the commercial risk on this. And so as we look at this judgment layer that needs to be created earlier on in the life cycle of these companies, that's an example where the clinical study could be designed from a technical regulatory perspective in a completely reasonable way. But in isolation, in that siloed mentality, if there's not that integrated layer to connect some of these points, you're going to miss the retiring of necessary risk at the stage of the company that you're at. So companies could spend millions generating evidence, but do it in a way that isn't valid enough or isn't sufficient enough in shaping decisions. So that's not a clinical mistake. It's not a regulatory mistake. That's an operating model mistake.
Gotcha.
And where does strong technical or clinical progress fail to translate into investor confidence?
Oh, good question. A few things come to mind. One, I mean, the company has proved that something is real, but you need to prove something is real in the context of something that the market was waiting for. There needs to be a market requirement for that. And so, you may run a study that shows performance equivalence relative to a precedent device that's out there, and that's impressive from a technical milestone perspective. But an investor is going to step into that conversation with a question of not really does the device work in principle, but does the evidence that you've developed support coverage? Will it actually change surgeon or physician behavior? The economics hold in outpatient settings. There's all these other questions that sort of come along with that. So as we look at that as an example, I think there's this sense of translating what is you're proving relative to what the market is waiting for. So I think that's one thing. I think another potential failure point is this sense of sequencing. You in financial speak, I call you create financial leverage. What that really means is as capital gets consumed, the next round feels more like a narrative bridge rather than a risk-adjusted reprice, meaning there's sort of the sequencing in the capital that follows along the valuation story over time. This is why I think later stage capital has become so concentrated, because investors are really starting to reward companies that, they're not just showing effort, but there is this ordered path of proof over time. And capital follows proof, it doesn't follow effort. So I think that's, again, getting back to the sense of, more than just conviction. We're funding more than just conviction at this point. I would say maybe the last thought is failure mode is on translation. When companies, when they make meaningful progress, does management do an adequate job of explaining the strategic significance clearly? I think often founding teams feel like, well, investors are like paying for data, they're paying for outcomes, they're paying for clinical studies. So, that's good. Like, well, yes, but you need to do the interpretation of the business. So what it means is you need to tie in the outcomes relative to that risk reduction story. How do certain clinical studies actually reduce regulatory uncertainty over time? How does it strengthen your reimbursement thesis? How is it going to help you increase adoption, confidence? This is where if you don't narrate that change in risk, the market's not going to give you full credit for it. So I think those three things come to mind, in terms of where do we see some rather key failure points.
Yeah, makes sense. Totally. Yeah.
Mhm. And Chris, how are companies potentially sabotaging capital efficiency early on?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think I would double down on that. So I would double down on this idea of misalignment. I don't see a lot of careless companies out there. I think most of the portfolio companies I would say almost all the portfolio companies that we work with, I would describe them as very disciplined, but they're very disciplined inside their functions, right? And so sort of doubling down on this misalignment, this judgment layer that we talk about. So the problem isn't that it's undisciplined spending, it's disciplined spending, but with silo mentality. That's what creates capital efficiency at enterprise level. So, for example, do we over engineer certain pathways in improving, whether it's product design, beyond what is required for that next regulatory, clinical, or commercial inflection point? Internally within an engineer, it's hard to ask an engineer. They're going to want to like over-engineer stuff. That's what they do, and that feels like progress for them. But none of those, and so decisions along that pathway, none of them feel irrational in isolation. In that silo, they all are justifiable. They're just expensive, and if the company hasn't really identified and laser focused in on the proof points that are necessary, you're going to see some destruction of capital. You're going to see some inefficiency in the capital. So again, as we sort of see this capital movement in a later stage, and investors starting to invest in later rounds, we need to look at that as a market signal. Early companies need to arrive with more coherence and not just vision. So line I like to use is like, if you could spend $10 million and still not material change the enterprise value, you're not reducing the right risks in the right order. And that happens. We'll burn through that kind of capital, and because of the sequencing, because of that judgment layer in terms of how we've sort of built out the operating model overall, we've done it in the wrong order. We see unnecessary capital outlay.
Interesting. How early should reimbursement shape decisions and decision making?
Yeah, I love that question, because I would say 9 times out of 10, for early stage, say discovery stage, seed stage, pre-seed stage companies, it's not really even on their radar screen. And it's a little bit of a pull to get them to recognize and start to address reimbursement and adoption dynamics. This isn't about simply taking market access and adoption doesn't begin after FDA. We can't do that anymore. Mechanisms of clinical success need to be tied to economic reality. So if you conceptualize everything a little bit too much, you end up designing this company around approval instead of adoption. And you get so laser focused on FDA pathways, you start to lose commercial value in that equation. This is becoming more apparent in overall health tech, where we see shifts into ASCs or ambulatory surgical centers, outpatient settings, in those environment, economics and workflow matter a lot. McKinsey talks about this. They've highlighted growth of non-traditional sites of care as this is a major medtech trend, and it is definitely impacting how early stage companies think about evidence and product positioning. So we may have a product that's clinically strong, but it will struggle in what we talk about. How are you going to get out of committee? What that means is if it doesn't fit into the economics and the workflow, adoption is going to suffer. And the earlier you begin to address and build that into your operating model, the better off you're going to be.
And when you step into a company, what signals tell you that it can scale?
Well, first and foremost, is there really a coherent center of gravity to the company? Like, is there sort of this center locus of it? And what I'll ask leadership teams is, can you articulate with a reasonable degree of granularity what the 1, 2, or 3 gating risks are that matter most right now? And then out of that, let's build the budget, let's build the milestones, let's build the study designs, let's wrap around the external narrative around all of those points. And then create the tie-in to say, like, okay, does this narrative really resolve those risks? Let's pressure test that. So even an early stage company, if we do that, what we've seen is even early stage companies look almost surprisingly investable. We've also seen the opposite. If we don't do that, even companies who have very strong tech, they can look diffuse. They can look a little too aspirational and ambitious, and you haven't really articulated what that risk retirement pathway is going to look like. So you run into some companies that have these very prolonged development efforts, and through that process, you see this sort of strategic drift. Each function within the company has a very clear and legitimate plan. Engineering has a plan, regulatory has a plan. But they don't all converge into a singular, sharp enterprise thesis. So a lot of really great activity, everything in and of itself, very respectable, very intelligent, very smart, very rational, but very little cumulative leverage overall. So you see this sort of frequent re-narrating of the company through these early stage life cycles, because they're always, they're very often in a reactionary mode. What has really changed in the market? Management isn't sure what changes really mattered most. And so if management can't clearly identify and answer those questions, then I think that there's a structural issue underneath.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a pattern where, a couple of times you've mentioned the issue of different departments doing really well, but because they're sort of operating in silos, let's say, it creates, bigger problems that individually they're not responsible for, but collectively they might be. Who, for lack of a better term, whose fault is that? Is that on the CEO, or why do you think that happens?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's almost not necessarily a fault aspect. It feels a little. It can feel a little confusing because it's like, well, we're not talking about big teams. I mean, it's not like there's 50 people or 100 people working inside of these, early stage medtech companies. And so it's not necessarily individual fault as it is lack of systemic thinking. Even within early stage medtech companies, you may only have a couple of engineers. You may only have like a part-time regulatory person. The question is, not do these people talk to each other. It's like, well, yeah, they all talk to each other and they all work together. Is there a judgment layer that sits over the top of that that aggregates this into a systemic thesis that is translatable relative to what investors are looking for, what they're underwriting, and is that a coherent narrative? So it's not necessarily the fault of any one person. It is the combination of a couple of different things. One is the capital pressure as we start looking at the expectations for earlier stage MedTech and operating more, less out of conviction and more into proof, and being able to demonstrate that more cohesive narrative around risk reduction. That systemic thinking is what has been lacking. So as I think about it from a CFO's perspective, it is the best position to be in because you're the one that needs to be that translation layer. You need to be able to take all of this disparate activities, even if it's a small company, even if there's only like half a dozen people working in the organization, you need to be that layer that comes in and says, like, well, here's the judgment layer. Here's all this stuff is coming together. This is what your investment thesis looks like. It evolves and changes over time, for sure. We learn new things and we refine, but there needs to be that judgment layer over the top of that that demonstrates some a level of systemic thinking that ties all of these activities of risk reduction, ultimately tying it to what does that investor conversation look like, and is all of this coherent relative to increasing enterprise value.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, I'm curious. So, how should founders think about sequencing milestones? To kind of create value and create like the maximum amount of momentum within the growth of their company.
Yeah, we take a process of reverse engineering. It's not brain surgery, and I think it's rather intuitive for most folks. When we look at companies, we start with the next financing round, major strategic pivot decision point. We use that and then we work backwards. But we don't work backwards from an internal company mindset to say, oh, like to get here, this is my budget, here's my cash flow needs. We look at it through the mindset of what needs to be delivered more specifically at that point in time based on the market's criteria, not internal groupthink and what we believe. And that can be sort of a point of consternation, and a little bit of a push-pull, because there can be some very strong internally held beliefs like this is exactly what we need to do. It's like, but that's not what's required. It might be required later. It's not required right now. So let's not be really inefficient with capital. Let's just focus on the things that are going to be required to get to that next value inflection point. So that's when we talk about so what does that mean in practice? Well, what that means in practice is, what does a serious seed stage investor, what are they looking for? What is an institutional Series A, Series B, and then maybe even later strategic investor, larger strategic. What do they need to believe that they don't believe now today? And so you're always sort of planning into that next conversation and putting yourself in the room with them and saying, what won't they believe today, but what do they need to believe at that point in time when we decide, when we're ready to have that conversation, and then you sort of reverse back in and say, well, what evidence changes that belief when we get there? So whatever that sequence of actions generates, that needs to then equate to the evidence. And then we develop the budget. Then we look at, okay, what delivers on that with the absolute smallest amount of burn possible without sacrificing too much option value. So this isn't about doing stuff the absolute cheapest way, but is looking at making smart decisions throughout that process and saying it's not just about risk retirement, but it's starting to create that narrative. So there's a new level of sophistication here that didn't exist before. There's all new sorts of decisioning frameworks that are starting to emerge. It's getting founders to think a little bit more broadly. This isn't just about product build. This could be a narrower study, not a broadened study. It could be introducing clarity around commercial endpoints earlier on in the process. This isn't about more data. It could be being a little bit more specific about regulatory interaction and what makes that pathway a little bit more predictable. So there's all of these different nuances throughout the conversations. Most of it is intuitive, but without that integrative layer over the top, some of this stuff gets lost in the noise. So what we end up with is a very clear milestone-driven plan. And the milestones aren't driven by technical delivery of anything. They're reverse engineered based on value inflection. So this isn't progress planning. This is investment against new value inflection points in the company.
What do you think will differentiate the next generation of successful medtech companies?
Integrating proof. I would say integrating proof. That's what I would say. So next generation medtech companies, they're going to understand that whether it's product proof, whether it's regulatory proof, whether it's commercial proof, reimbursement adoption proofs, these are not separate stories that sort of get stacked one on top of another. This isn't a project plan bill where it's like, I got all my swim lanes for each one of these things. Every company can say that, and MedTech's been talking that way. Early stage MedTech's been talking that way for as long as I can remember. The next generation of MedTech is going to have to be much more integrated with that. That's what's going to create financial leverage earlier on in the life cycle of these companies. I think we're seeing that already in earlier stage conversations. Where I would note, cash flow economics, scale economics. And what I mean by scale economics is, as you start to shift out of some of these technical risk retirement, whether it's technical regulatory, as we start moving into commercial adoption, we're being pressured more and more to resolve some of those risks where historically that would not have been required. And so depth of thought around some of these things and developing integrated nation, we're seeing these in investor conversations now in increasing frequency. So companies that stand out, it's no longer going to be just about better science for medtech. You're going to have a better architecture for demonstrating how the science actually converts into value. And then the really strong companies are going to know how to deploy capital against those constraints. What I mean by constraints, I mean like the uncertainties and risks around that. You're going to see much stronger intelligence, increased intelligence around how we generate that evidence and how we do it across multiple stakeholders. This isn't just about investors, but it can be about physicians, it can be about hospital systems, it can be about committees, and others. But the operating model discipline is going to be the strategic weapon for them, and how you tell that story and it not being so aspirational, but what I'll call underwritable. I don't even know if that's a word. But can the market actually underwrite the story, and are you talking about it through that lens? So that's the thing is, historically, there was maybe this loose mindset that capital, you throw it at science and it sort of creates value. I don't think that's the case anymore. What creates value in early stage medtech is risk reduction. That's what creates value. The winners moving forward, those are the companies that are going to understand that much earlier in their life cycle. If you start figuring that out in your early discovery phases, if you're just starting to do animal cadaver modeling and you already have a pretty comprehensive risk register and milestone driven plan on how you believe that's going to work out, you will set yourself into a class over and above any of your peers, and certainly what early stage investors are normally accustomed to. So that's going to set you up for a much more winning formula.
Interesting. Yeah. Here's a random question for you. What gave your company the name Easer21? Because it seems random. Like, I'd be curious to know where the name came from.
Yeah, seems random. It's a ancient biblical term, and Azer, it's a ancient Hebraic term, and it means critical help, but not critical help in terms of like, hey, I'm here to kind of help you out. It's a bit more of a warrior in times of war kind of help, and it's more of I'm going to do battle with you. And so it was a term we gravitated towards that really encompassed not only a reflection of what we saw happening in the market in general, not to say that, as founders, we're going to go and fight. What it really is reflective of is the mentality. Being a founder is no easy road, not for anybody, even the most successful. And Azer and the meaning behind it demonstrated our understanding and appreciation for what that road is going to feel like, and that we really understand, where that is. And so it's intended to not only showcase the market dynamics, this is what this environment feels like, we're understanding and appreciative of that environment. I think the second thing, and maybe more important thing, is reframing the role of CFO away from just operational financial expertise, but internal leader and operating partner. So it's not to say like we're not COOs. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the CFO is the best person, the best role, and finding the right person in that role. You need that individual to be this integrative layer. You need this person to be highly strategic, especially in early stage MedTech. They need to be writing your investment thesis. They should be writing your pitch deck. They should have, second only to the CEO, they should have more depth of understanding in the market and your business model and the dynamics of your company and how you're creating value more than anybody else. It should be CEO, and then a very close section should be CFO, and then everybody else after that. And so Azer was also descriptive in terms of what we were anticipating this role in this market space needed to evolve into, which was more than like, hey, I can do business modeling, I can give you cash flow forecasts, like I can manage your budget, I can give you R&D tax credit work, I can support all of those more typical operational CFO elements. But this need for early stage CEOs to have more adequate support when it comes to making this transition from like, hey, this, if you're a pre-seed stage med tech company, you can't be looking at yourself as just an interesting science project. Capital now is starting to shift, and you need to respond accordingly. And so Azer21 was really designed to address that need in particular, and we branded it, in a way to evoke that.
Yeah. And what about the 21 part of it as well?
It shows up 21 times in the Old Testament.
Interesting. That's cool. Wow.
First time it shows up is in the Genesis account, and that one is in reference to Eve. And so when Eve is created a second to Adam, she's referred to as Azer, Adam's helper. But of the 20 times that it's mentioned, it's actually 18 of those as an attribute that they associate with God. And in every single case, it's in times of war or battle.
Interesting.
18 times. Yep.
Cool.
So that's the.
Interesting. Wow. Well,
Yeah,
if I didn't ask, I never would have known. So
it's
Yeah,
a
very
little
cool.
it's a little different. It's not necessarily descriptive, but there is a little bit of a nuance behind it. There is some logic behind it, in terms of how we wanted to sort of drive the conversation with early founders.
yeah, well, I guess the brand story, if you like, is always important. So there you go. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the way that your CFO approach is very much through a creative lens, as opposed to a lot of CFO traditional types is more kind of reactive in hindsight type measure. So yeah, I really like that kind of very not just creative but adaptive and strategic level of things. So definitely a key differentiator there. Chris, if anybody's for people listening to the show just now, where's the best place to find you and contact you?
Yeah, best place, email me. So you have my email below, chris@azer21.com. Would love to hear from anybody. Absolutely.
Nice. And that's EZER21.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. Incredible perspective and knowledge on the sort of MedTech landscape at the moment. So yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Finn. Appreciate you having me on. I appreciate having me on.
Yeah, great having you.
And for the viewers and listeners, thanks for tuning in. As always, see you in the next one.